If you listen to the experts, medicine, it's getting an upgrade.
We were practicing this thing called Medicine 1.0, Medicine 2.0, Medicine 3.0.
And it doesn't stop there. Like any tech bubble, there's a purported whole step improvement before you even have a chance to take a breath.
Let me explain what Medicine 4.0 is in detail.
Somehow we've been led to believe that scientific revolutions in medicine are as straightforward as software updates. But actual science typically takes a twisting path, and decades of evidence, hypothesis testing, modeling, clinical trials in actual humans, just to see if new approaches actually lead to better outcomes. But that hasn't stopped battalions of profiteers from telling you that they know medical secrets that other people don't.
I guarantee you stem cells will help that.
Right.
I've had tremendous success with stem cells.
Over the last few weeks, I've been exposing bad actors in the field of regenerative medicine who sling stem cells, peptides, exosomes, and fecal transplants like they are divine ambrosia. And I'm still in the middle of my research on Adil Khan's stem cell clinic to the stars. The doctor who likely gave the functional medicine doctor, Mark Hyman, sepsis. And one question just keeps on coming into my mind and in the comments of that series. It's this: is regenerative medicine itself a false promise, or is there real science to the field? This is a long way for me to introduce today's guest. Matt Kaeberlein is a biogerontologist at the University of Washington and an expert in aging and longevity. He's also a whistleblower on charlatans in the longevity field, famously exposing the impossible claims of David Sinclair's results on reversing dog aging. Now, you might recognize him from a previous interview I did with him a few years ago, where we disagreed on the philosophical basis of longevity medicine. But we are talking about extending lifespans with pills that promote seemingly almost magical results.
I don't think they're magical. I think you're using words that don't actually make sense in this context.
And we disagree on a lot of things. In fact, that is why I'm bringing him on the show today, because despite some philosophical conflicts, I don't doubt his scientific integrity. We are both able to look at the same bed of evidence and make rational assessments of what that evidence actually means. You can find his work on the Optispan podcast, and I've included a link to it down in the show notes. Thanks so much for being on the show again, Matt.
Thanks, Scott. It's really a pleasure to be back. And I got to say, I'm really enjoying your content, so keep doing what you're doing. I think you bring a ton of value to this space. And I also would be interested maybe on a future opportunity to sit down and figure out what do we actually disagree on, because I suspect we agree on a lot more than we disagree on. But getting people together who are thoughtful and coming at this from the perspective of just wanting to get the truth out there, identifying those places where we disagree, I think leads to important conversations. So all of that's just to say thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. In fact, one of the problems in the world right now is people think that they're always right, and you just sit in your camps. And right. What we actually need to do is read the actual evidence that's out there and then have reasonable conversations on it. Anyway, thanks for being here. And my first question, let's just go really basic, since the point of this conversation is about regenerative medicine. What is regenerative medicine?
Yeah, so I would characterize regenerative medicine as an approach, a science-based approach to restore lost function in cells, tissues, and organs by repairing damage that has accumulated. And in that way, it's really just a different way of approaching functional decline and disease. The approaches can include cell-based therapies, and that's where stem cells and immune modulating approaches come from, can include drugs, so small molecules that harness the body's own repair pathways, or it can include things like tissue engineering, right? So true engineering approaches, but that all falls under this idea of repair. And I guess maybe one way I would think about it is you can contrast that with, say, traditional medicine, which also does have some regenerative aspects to it, but is largely reactive, right? It's more of a Band-Aid approach after damage has happened and pathology has occurred, or what I would call proactive healthcare, which is about, as much as possible, preventing the damage before it happens. Regenerative medicine is the repair of damage. And so from that perspective, I think it's absolutely a valid approach, and there's a lot of real science there. Now, as you alluded to, as is often the case, the opportunistic people get way ahead of the science and try to take advantage of opportunities that they see to make money off of gullible individuals who want access to these kinds of approaches.
Yeah, there's always this tension between like what you hope something will do and what it can actually do. And that's where marketing, we've seen, sort of like just sneaks in and, in my opinion, causes quite a bit of damage. Let's talk about stem cells in particular, though, first, because I know the field is huge, but the last, let's say, 20 years, stem cells have been touted as being able to regenerate just about any tissue. And that is like super exciting stuff. But the advances have seemed to be stuck. Now, how much evidence have we seen in the clinical literature for these actually being effective?
Right. So I think it's certainly fair to say that both there's really exciting science and biology here, and the field has failed to deliver on the early promises. It's also important, I think, to separate what's done in the laboratory from what's done in the real world, in the clinic. So I think we can say in laboratory animals and in rodents and other mammals, stem cells look extremely promising. There have been hundreds of studies showing that you can modulate to benefit many different diseases or injury types by giving different types of stem cell therapies to rejuvenate function in tissues and organs in laboratory animals. As is almost always the case, when we try to move that into human beings, it gets complicated and things slow down. And sometimes the biology doesn't work the same way. And so I think there are lots of reasons why it feels like stem cells have stagnated or at least been extremely slow to deliver on the initial enthusiasm. And I will say, I think the enthusiasm, so here I'm going to blame the media. So I think part of this is that sometimes scientific results get presented and the media amplifies them and hypes them. And there are scientists who, we are both aware, are very good at also hyping their own results and build false expectations. So why hasn't stem cell therapies advanced as fast as we might have hoped and expected? That's complicated. There's a lot of reasons. I think some of it is that the regulatory environment has been challenging. And again, a lot of people don't remember, you go back to the early 2000s, there were federal bans on basic research on certain types of stem cells. So that's contributed. It's hard to do clinical trials for regenerative therapies. There are a lot of risks associated with regenerative therapies. We may talk more about this. Many regenerative therapies, because they promote growth and repair, they can also promote cancer. We want to be very careful about rushing therapies into the clinic that can cause cancer, right? So I think there's lots of reasons. And then something that is, an area that I think a lot about and that I've been talking about for a long time is stem cell therapies don't work very well in old animals or old people. So the aged environment of our biology makes it more challenging for the stem cells to do their regenerative activities. And unfortunately, science is often siloed, and scientists who study stem cells haven't really appreciated you have to do things a little bit differently if you want to use these therapies in older humans where there's a lot of inflammation. The growth promoting signals and regenerative signals are generally tamped down. So all of that's to say there's good reasons why it's been slow. So I would frame it as there's still a lot of potential to stem cell therapies within certain domains, but I don't think it's likely that stem cells are going to be the cure-all that some people were hoping that they would be for every ailment that's out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was writing this book, it was called The Red Market. It was about organ trafficking around the world. And one of the things that I was doing is I was going to stem cell clinics in India and sort of looking at what they were offering to medical tourists and things like that. But that was like 2011. So that was like 15 years ago, where these clinics were letting people coming in. And sometimes you'd have these amazing results. You'd show an angiogram with someone's, their vasculature regenerating. And then whenever there was no results, that stuff didn't get reported at all. And there was always this hype for that. And to think that was 15 years ago, we have this idea that we're going to be advancing, in 2 or 3 years, we're going to have really great stem cell stuff. But we didn't really see that for a long time. Right now, though, there's a lot of hype, a lot of discussion about very recent breakthroughs in stem cells, especially around something called the Dawa Muse stem cells. This is a Japanese researcher named Mari Dawa. And there's a lot of excitement about it. Now, Are they really a breakthrough?
I think they are a breakthrough from a basic science perspective for sure. So basically, what was done was to take what are called mesenchymal stem cells. So Muse stands for multilineage differentiating stress enduring mesenchymal stem cells. So that's where the Muse comes from. And basically, what Dawa did was to take this heterogeneous or mixed population of stem cells and select for cells that are particularly stress resistant. And that means both nutrient stress and hypoxic stress, so low oxygen. And when she did this, she found that these stem cells had really interesting properties. So it's a breakthrough from a biological perspective, because this was kind of the first indication that mesenchymal stem cells are actually a whole bunch of different types of stem cells. And you could get these very specific Muse stem cells from this mixed population, and they have interesting properties. What are those interesting properties? So they seem to be more pluripotent, meaning that they can take on different activities, turn into different cell types down the road. Importantly, they seem to have lower cancer risk. So stem cells and pluripotent stem cells in particular are associated with a type of cancer called teratomas, and the Muse cells don't seem to have that risk. That's really important from a clinical translational perspective. And they seem to better move to sites of injury through mechanisms that aren't completely understood. So for all those reasons, they seem promising. There's very little clinical evidence yet, though, that they are going to live up to that promise in people. And this is where I think there's a lot of confusion, because in Japan, they received what's called a conditional approval from the Japanese version of the FDA. What that means is that those cells can be used in clinics in Japan legally within very narrow indications, not because they've been proven to work, but because they have sufficient short-term safety. That's the conditional part. FDA has something like this as well. And what it does is it allows companies, if there's enough evidence for safety, it allows companies to get the proof that the treatment actually works by going to market and giving it to people without actually knowing if it works. So we don't know about efficacy, but short-term safety at least seemed pretty good in Japan. So they gave it this conditional approval. The challenge is a lot of people misinterpret that as, oh, this has been shown to be safe and we can all go forward and start distributing this broadly. So to answer your question, promising, but very, very early. And again, my intuition is this will be sort of a step breakthrough, but it's not, again, going to get us to the point where everybody's getting stem cell therapies to get younger. Like, it's not going to have that large of an effect. But I do think that these Muse stem cells will have specific indications where probably 10 years from now, you'll start to see them be routinely used in different clinics.
Well, this leads to this like really interesting gap, right? Where we have people, because the Dawa stem cells are like the Ferrari of stem cell clinics all over the world. There are
Today,
stem cell
but that'll
clinics.
change, right? This is the thing. I mean, I've been in this space long enough to know that next week it's going to be something else. So you see this kind of stuff come and go, right? And I think there are a couple of things going on. One is there are opportunistic people who just grab the next shiny object and start selling it because they know they can. And I think, unfortunately, that many of the medical professionals who gravitate to this space are also the medical professionals that aren't particularly strong critical thinkers. And so they kind of, I think they actually believe this stuff. And so they're constantly grabbing on to the next shiny object that's going to change the world and recommending it to their patients, not recognizing that they've done this 4 or 5 or 6 times before, right? So I suspect that there will be something else 6 months from now that's got everybody all excited.
And that's sort of the way it works, right? Is that once they're fads, right? And someone gloms onto this fad because, there are legitimate limits to Western conventional medicine, right? Where we, you get really sick, you got a chronic condition, pain, what about IBS, brain fog, whatever you want to call your specific set of ailments. And then Western medicine doesn't have the tool based on evidence to do anything about it. And then you're like, well, heck, I'm feeling this stuff. Let me jump ship onto Instagram, and maybe Instagram will have a solution. What would you say would be maybe the dangers of this sort of approach?
Well, obviously there are lots of dangers. I mean, I think, first of all, I think what you said is really important, that if you have a debilitating condition that's dramatically impacting your quality of life, you are very likely to be more willing to take risks to have a positive outcome to that condition. That's totally understandable. I do the same thing. I think we all would. The problem is that most of these experimental therapies have not been appropriately tested for safety or efficacy. That's where the FDA approval or other regulatory body approval is important. Now, there's lots of problems with FDA and the way they work and how hard it is to go through that process. But if you have an approved therapy, you can have some confidence that it's been shown to have efficacy, meaning it works to some extent, and that it can be done safely. The problem when you get outside of that is, first of all, we don't know if it's going to work. You might be willing to accept that, but the challenge is around the safety piece. And there's two pieces here I think that are really important. One is the drug or the therapy itself safe, or are there going to be unanticipated negative consequences down the road? With things like stem cells, those negative consequences can be catastrophic, right? You could be paralyzed for the rest of your life. You could develop a cancer. You could die. So recognizing that there are potentially catastrophic side effects from the therapy itself, and we don't know how frequent those are, is one thing to be aware of. I think the bigger issue, though, and this is true with peptides, which we may get to as well, there's now a black market for stem cells and peptides and other small molecule therapeutics where the manufacturing piece just to make the product is in question. And so you can get impurities in the manufacturing. It might not be actually what the label claims is in the vial. I think that's where we get most of the severe negative reactions that we're seeing out there, is because these things are being manufactured, who knows where, not to standards, GMP standards or other high standards of manufacturing. Impurities get in there that cause allergic reactions. And so that's what causes people to get very, very sick and die in many cases. So you have both of those risks that go along with exploring experimental therapies that are outside of the regulatory realm. And then in general, and this is in general, there are some good clinics that offer experimental therapies. I don't want to say that everybody's a bad actor or being sloppy, but by and large, the individuals who gravitate towards opening offshore clinics for medical tourism are not the highest quality medical professionals that are out there. And so you run the risk of getting care from somebody who is sloppy or uninformed, and that's going to increase the likelihood that something bad is going to happen to you. So I think all of those things you need to think about if you want to explore this area of medicine.
One thing that I've come across in my investigation, and this is going to be sort of detailed a lot more, and I think what's going to be the next video in this series. But there is this, as you mentioned, a black market for these cells. So we have these Dawa Muse cells, which are very hot right now. They're hot, and they come from a lab in Japan, and they have every incentive to, when they sell their Dawa Muse stem cell package, that it is exactly what they say in that package, because they, obviously they want money because they want their product to get out there. But there's also all these other clinics, because they're like, wow, that costs $5,000 for us to buy it before we sell it to our patient to get that thing. But what if we just took the scientific papers and looked for the markers on the cells from an umbilical cord and say those were the same Muse cells, and we sell those? And you can actually get those cells, or these things that are marketed as those cells, for like $500 on the market, increasing your profits by $4,500 on that package. So there's a lot of incentive in these other clinics to create this black market. And then I'm hearing stories about people like taking packages of frozen cells across borders from Lithuania to France to Mexico, to all these places with these counterfeit cells, because they're being driven by this marketing engine that we see from health influencers who seem to jump from treatment to treatment to treatment to treatment, hoping that they can fix their chronic illnesses.
Yeah, no, I think what you just described is exactly accurate. And I know many stories of exactly the same thing happening. I know some people who have smuggled cells across borders. So it happens. And I think this gets back to the larger problem. Once you get outside of the sort of official regulatory environment, all bets are off. And I think there are well-intentioned people who really want to get these therapies to patients who they believe need them, and they can fall prey to the marketers who will tell them, yeah, these are really Muse stem cells or whatever therapy you're talking about. But then there are a lot of dishonest people who will just change the label, right? They know they're not Muse stem cells. They just change the label, claim that they are, sell them to clinics. So again, and here's where I think stem cells in particular are very problematic. So let's say with something like, a very simple medicine like metformin, it's very easy to do a test and say, yes, that's metformin in the vial. It's 99.9% pure. You can go to companies that will do that for you for $50. With stem cells, that's not possible. You need very specialized equipment and expertise to be able to say, yes, these are in fact Muse stem cells from a whatever 48-year-old person, and that they are an appropriate match for your condition, right? So it's not easy to test the purity of the products that are being used. And so that just makes it, much more likely, I think, that people are going to be getting product that is not exactly what they think they're getting. And so this is where I don't have any, this is why personally I have been very hesitant to really explore stem cells as something that I want to get involved in from a clinical perspective at all, or for myself. Like I would never do them right now because I have no idea who to trust. I think if I knew the source of the stem cells and I knew what kind of stem cells and I knew the very specific indication, I would feel pretty confident that it could be done safely, confident enough to try it myself if I had a condition that I thought it would be helpful for. But right now, outside of the few regulatory locations where you can do that safely, all bets are off. And so that's why I personally have just struggled a lot with stem cells, because there's just no way to know who to believe and who to trust.
All right, and now we get to the point where we talk about Mark Hyman, because one of the most important faces of modern medicine right now, Mark Hyman, and the reason why he's such an important face, because he's like almost a direct advisor, at least a direct conduit to RFK Jr. He's the father of functional medicine. And in my first video in the series, I talked about how he got a stem cell shot from Adil Khan's clinic, which is a Turner Health in Mexico, which is sort of the broader subject that I'm looking at. And he got pretty sick, almost died. What can you tell me about what your observations are on that case and your sort of experience with sort of watching it as well from the sort of the same sources I was looking at, probably?
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I don't know any of the specifics firsthand, right? So everything that I have heard comes through the sort of rumor network for people who are plugged in this field. Having said that, anybody who's networked well within the longevity field knows that what apparently happened to Mark Hyman is not a one-off. This has happened multiple times before. It will happen multiple times again, where somebody apparently, allegedly, I'll use that word, goes and gets an experimental therapy and has a catastrophic bad outcome, right? This happens all the time. And so lots of us in the field talk about these things, share experiences that we've heard about. So my understanding of what happened to Mark Hyman comes from being told by 3 or 4 different people, very similar story. And I think the first time I heard this, it was about a year ago, maybe a little bit more. The story that I heard was that Mark went to a stem cell clinic in Mexico, had a very negative reaction to the therapy that almost killed him. Right, that's basically the level that I heard the story at. And then since then, I've heard additions to that where, it was sepsis, which is what your reporting seems to indicate as well. That matches up. That was caused by bacterial contamination. And that, again, allegedly either came from the water that was used in preparing one of the reagents for the procedure or lack of sterile conditions within the clinic, right? Very easy to believe that could happen. And that makes perfect sense with all of the little pieces of information that we've got. So again, I've heard 3 or 4 people tell me pretty much the same story, at least 2 of whom told me that they got the information from a WhatsApp group where apparently Mark shared this information amongst a group of longevity doctors. So again, I don't know for sure what really happened, but there's lots of evidence all sort of pointing towards a consistent story that there was a clinic in Mexico where an experimental procedure, probably involving stem cells, led to a bacterial infection that became life-threatening. And that led to long-term complications. So if that's true, and here's where, I think we need to recognize every person has the right to share their own medical experiences or not, right? So if that's true, if it were me and something like that happened to me, I would share it with the people who follow me, because I think it's an important warning to people that, there are risks associated with these kinds of experimental therapies, and you should be aware of the risks. First of all, I'm not somebody who has, and I don't think I ever will, recommend that people go do these kinds of risky things. But particularly if I was somebody who recommended that to people, I would feel an ethical and moral obligation to share my experience with them. Mark has not done that. that's his choice. And that's sort of the way I look at the situation.
I find this exactly, my feeling is exactly the same as you. His whole platform is recommending various treatments. Like I get a newsletter from him. He hasn't taken me off his newsletter yet. I get his newsletter every week, and it's like, here's the new device you need to try. You need to try this device. And they're constantly recommending people to go to these clinics. And it might have been unsterile conditions in this laboratory that administered it. It could have also been in the preparation of those Muse stem cells, which may or may not have come from the Dawa lab, right? Could have just come from some off-brand lab for him to save money. And when money is the motivating factor for a doctor, or for anyone really, but you have these incentives to make more of it, right? In any way you can. One of the various regenerative medicine people that I was speaking to is is sort of clued into this black market. He's like, yeah, this is OG gangster shit, right? This is like, what you're actually seeing. Remember Scarface when he's got the cocaine all over his face? Well, they're doing these cutting things in the product as well. The same scams that work in any other commodity also work in these in bewildering ways. But I think there's this other part to this discussion, which is that when people are on the search for stem cells, right, they've gotten to a point where their chronic condition is in a rough spot and mainstream medicine ain't working. Maybe they even had a bad experience with mainstream medicine because mainstream medicine has its own dangers. And then they start stacking treatments. And I'm thinking in particular with Jordan Peterson's case, he didn't only get stem cells from Adil Khan. He was talking to Tony Robbins over and over again. And Tony Robbins would say, hey, go to Khan's clinic, go to this other clinic, go to these other things. They're getting fecal transplants. They're getting, I don't know if he got a fecal transplant, but they're sort of stacking treatments. And in this experimental phase based on like, bro, this is going to be good. I know this sounds obvious, but I just want you to state the obvious. Is that additionally risky?
Of course. But I mean, again, I think, yes. So combining multiple interventions at the same time obviously comes with additional risks, both because each intervention itself has a risk profile, right? A side effect profile. And we really don't understand what happens when we combine complex biological interactions in the human body. Having said that, again, I think one of the things I always try to do is go back to what the patient is experiencing, right? There's a lot of desperation that goes along with this. I think anybody who's ever had a debilitating condition will recognize that there is a desperation to find something that's going to help. And so I think that wanting to get access to these experimental therapies that might help is perfectly natural. And many people are willing to accept the risk reward, even if the risk is I'm going to get a bad batch of stem cells, that's going to have bacteria in it. I think where I land is what those of us who really want to see this space move forward should be trying to think about is, are there ways to allow people to get access to some of these therapies, recognizing we're not going to have the double-blind randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials anytime soon, but where it can be done safely and where we can get some data around efficacy from these N of one sort of experiences. And there are ways to do that. And we're starting to see some movement in that direction. Now, we'll see if it actually gets anywhere, but we're starting to see these state right to try laws that, if regulated appropriately, could provide a framework for people to get access to these therapies under an appropriate regulatory framework where we'll know product quality, we'll be able to track safety and efficacy. So that's a step in the right direction. So I try to think about solutions. So it's good to talk about the problems, but I also try to think about solutions and how we can actually make things better, because I think we should have empathy for people who are suffering and who want access to medical therapies that might help them, rather than only villainizing the bad actors that are out there. We should absolutely villainize the bad actors. They're bad actors, but let's also think about ways we can help people at the same time.
So how does that work? And I think I'm stuck on the same sort of philosophical problem that you are. We have evidence-based medicine, which means we have evidence for something clinically working. Doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean it's ambrosia. It means it's relatively safely and the benefits outweigh the risks. That's sort of like where the FDA lands. And then we have this whole genre of things that are promising in mice right? 18 mice in Lebanon did great on this treatment. Maybe we'll try them on humans, right? And then maybe there is something there. There's a pathway that usually you would do it in a different way, but there's people who are willing to put their bodies on the line for that. And then you have, but how do we do that? Like from a patient's perspective, I'm like me, I've got a chronic illness. I want it treated. The first place I'm going to get information is Instagram or YouTube or something like that, right? It's going to be a Google search into AI, and Sam Altman is going to be like, well, the best clinic for this is X, Y, and Z. Yeah. You're talking about a regulatory framework for professional lab rats. How does that? I mean, what do you think? How does that look?
Yeah. So again, I think you could do a whole episode on just the way FDA works. I've learned so much just looking into this that blows my mind. So first of all, I think one thing to appreciate is, given the way FDA is set up, and this is legislatively mandated and policies, it is just not going to be the case that we are ever going to get the clinical trials we all want for many of these therapies. It's just not going to happen. And we could unpack that, but that's going to take a longer discussion. So given that is the way it is now, we need alternative approaches to test some of these things. And I think there are some really easy things that could be done. I'll give you a very specific example. Take 10% of the NIH budget and put it towards doing clinical trials for these experimental therapies, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials. Pharmaceutical companies aren't going to pay for them if they can't get patent protection. There's a bunch of stuff out there that probably helps people that will never get tested because the framework for FDA approval, the incentives don't allow that. Put 10% of the NIH budget to doing that. Within 5 years, we could wipe out 100 of the best candidates for experimental therapies and figure out who do they work for, how well do they work, what do the risks look like. That's a very easy policy thing that could be done. There are lots of reasons why it's not easy to actually implement that. So what I was talking about are these state level right to try laws. There's one in Montana. I think New Hampshire has passed. I believe Florida is working on this as well, where at the state level, medical practitioners are enabled to provide experimental therapies to patients, and they remove the liability. Of course, there has to be full informed consent. And then there are regulatory bodies that evaluate whether the therapy that this medical provider wants to offer is appropriate. So there's like an IRB, a human studies review board that oversees the process. So if that's done well, you could envision a way where people can get access to Dawa stem cells in Montana from a licensed medical practitioner. There would in order for that to be done well, safeguards would have to be put in place for the manufacturing and the quality control on those products, and for tracking adverse events and for tracking efficacy. So I think with those guardrails in place, this could be a useful middle ground, hopefully, while some of these other policy initiatives could be enacted that would have a larger impact.
Now, of course, that seems amazing if that could happen, right? And, it's funny when I think about RFK, I am not a fan of RFK, but, for so many reasons, I am not a fan of RFK. But it does seem like, in the current regulatory situation, he really likes experimental therapies, right? He just appointed Tony Robbins to the board of HHS. Yeah. As a medical advisor to fix American healthcare, Tony Robbins, original grifter. You could see them being like, well, why don't we just create a regulatory body to make this easy? Yeah, he could do it, if he wants to make America healthy, if that's his real plan. All right, wait. I'm off track. Let's talk about peptides because it connects immediately. It seems like everyone's doing peptides. We got GLP-1s, obviously insulin's is a peptide that has been very life-saving.
Right.
GLP-1s are hugely successful, but now other people are injecting all sorts of things into their bodies in a massive experiment. And, when I was speaking with Dave Asprey a few years ago, he asked me, what's the next big thing? What do you think the next big thing in the world is going to be? And I was like, I don't know, nothing, maybe just rational medicine. I was wrong. He said peptides. He was right. Tell me about peptides.
Sure. Yeah. So first thing to appreciate is the way the word peptide is used on Instagram and among a lot of longevity or functional medicine practitioners is actually not what that word means. So peptides are just a class of biomolecule that are ubiquitous in nature, and they are like any other drug. They can have all sorts of different effects on biological systems. Some of them are naturally produced, some aren't. Some of them are safe, some aren't. Some of them have benefits, some are toxic. So Bungara toxin is a peptide, it will kill you. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about the idea that peptides are some special class of drug that's brand new and it's going to have magic properties and it's all going to be good and no bad. No, they are just like any other type of biological molecule in that they are diverse and can have all sorts of different effects on biological systems. So in the medical sphere and the peptides that most people are excited about, I think it's important to bucket these things. One is FDA approved peptides. You mentioned the GLP-1 agonists or the GLP, GIP, like tirzepatide dual agonists. There are a small subset that have been FDA approved for different indications. And the most famous ones are the GLPs and GIPs for obesity and metabolic disease. There are a small number that are approved that target growth hormone signaling and can boost endogenous growth hormone signaling. Those are approved for things like lipodystrophy and HIV patients. So they have a very narrow indication. But once something is approved, it's easier for a doctor to prescribe that what's called off-label. And so some people are taking those types of peptides off-label for body composition. And then the vast majority of the peptides that people hear about are unapproved. They have never gone through clinical trials. Many of them have never gone through clinical trials. None of them, this other bucket, have FDA approval. Those include things like, BPC 157 and GHK copper is another one that a lot of people use, TB 500. There's a whole set of these common peptides that functional medicine and longevity medicine clinics are prescribing that are outside of the regulatory system. And this goes back to what we were talking about with stem cells. Once you get outside of that regulatory system, you have a couple of different types of risk. You have one, just the lack of data on whether they work or whether they're safe, and you have the manufacturing concerns. And so what we have seen is a lot of doctors, for reasons I don't completely understand, becoming comfortable prescribing these unapproved peptides outside of the legal framework. And so this is where I've been doing a lot of digging into the way FDA works and the way it doesn't work most of the time. And it's kind of mind-boggling. But to the best that I can tell, there is widespread illegal prescribing and pharmaceutical manufacturing of peptides right now that the FDA is just ignoring. And I sort of liken it to traffic laws. Like, we let people speed all the time. We don't enforce them. That's kind of, I think, where we're at with the peptides right now. Everybody knows it's against the law. At least I think most people know it's against the law, the doctors and the pharmacies. FDA knows it's against the law, but we're just going to let it go. And we're going to see what happens. And if people start dying, then we'll step in and do something about it. And so several years ago, FDA had enough of a signal that maybe not necessarily that people were dying, that people were getting hospitalized by compounding of some of these peptides, that they put about 19 or so of them on this special list that said compounding pharmacies can't compound these anymore. Compounding pharmacies, some are still compounding them. Doctors are still prescribing them. So it's not being enforced, but FDA did take the policy step, at least, of saying you shouldn't be compounding those peptides. They didn't do anything about it after that. That's the list that RFK has been talking about, moving back onto the legal to compound set. He said he's gonna stop the war on peptides. There's no war on peptides. FDA, if anything, FDA is not enforcing the regulations around peptides. But what he meant was move these set of peptides that have been put on the no compound list back onto the list that is legal to compound. I believe even once that's done, it's still illegal for a doctor to prescribe them because they are not approved by the FDA. But it's a step to sort of legitimize the idea that we think these things are safe enough for people to get access to them under the guidance of a licensed medical professional. And I'm trying to say all of this with no judgment. These are just facts as far as I can tell. I'm not judging the doctors who are doing this. It's just a fact that it's against the law. Look, I drive 10 miles per hour over the speed limit all the time. I break the law too. If we're going to treat it like a speeding ticket or not, we should just be upfront. That's the way we're tthinking about healthcare when it comes to peptides.
Which is a big experiment, though, because in the 1930s there was this I think it was a weight loss pill, right? That ramped up your metabolism,
Yeah.
and people sort of burned up on the inside. It was called like DPT or
DNP, yeah, DNP,
yeah,
dinitrophenol, yeah. So I can
Tell
tell
me
the
about
story if you, if you like. So, I mean, so let me first of all preface this by saying I don't think any of the peptides that people are getting right now are in the same class as DNP. There are other molecules that I am worried about, but I don't think the peptides are likely to have this particular effect. So DNP, or dinitrophenol, is a molecule that around the 1930s, maybe a little earlier, people noticed that workers who were exposed to this molecule were losing weight. And so then it started being tested in clinical experiments in people. And they found that indeed, dinitrophenol is a very potent weight loss drug. They could give it to people and they would lose 10, 20, 30 pounds really, really quickly. And it works really well. It probably works better than the GLP-1 agonists that we have today for weight loss. The downside to this is that the way dinitrophenol works, it's what people today would call a quote unquote mitochondrial activator. Be careful if your doctor is prescribing you a mitochondrial activator, you should listen to this story. So it's a mitochondrial activator because what DNP does, it's called an uncoupling agent. It basically allows protons to move across the mitochondrial membrane. And that's important because that causes the cell to just burn energy. The cell is just sort of like an engine that's idling at a really high rate, just burning energy. The problem is when you burn energy in the mitochondria, you generate heat. And so what started happening were these case reports started popping up in the literature of people taking DNP who developed hyperthermia. Their body temperature got so high that they either got severely ill or many people died. Because once you start this uncoupling reaction, you can't just shut it off. The molecule is in your body. It's not going to go away for some period of time. So they tried putting people in ice baths. That saved some people. But my understanding is since the 1930s, hundreds of people have died from DNP poisoning. So here's a case of a drug that's very efficacious. It works really, really well, but it has a very narrow therapeutic window. And if you get outside of that window, you have catastrophic side effects very quickly. This is a drug that lots of doctors thought was safe. They were prescribing to their patients because the vast majority of people didn't have any problem. They took the right amount, they took a low dose, they lost weight. But as soon as you get outside of that range, you get into some really, really deep water really, really quickly. And so I think as a lesson for people, this is a good example of what can go wrong when you start messing around with fundamental biology of our cells. And, some of these peptides target the mitochondria. Some of them are labeled as mitochondrial activators. I haven't seen any evidence that they cause hyperthermia, but I think it's just important to recognize we don't completely understand these biological systems and things can go wrong. And that's why we want to have, randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials, start slow, start small, develop the safety data so that people don't have to die from these things unnecessarily.
I mean, I always find the hypocrisy interesting. A lot of the people who are really into peptides and these experimental treatments were also the people who had those same critiques against the COVID vaccine, who said the COVID vaccine was the worst thing in the world. And yet they're also willing to just dose themselves with things that have much, much, much less testing.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that is definitely true, and I think this is partly human nature, there's this fallacy of the absence of data, right? So I think we look at a lot of FDA approved drugs and people are very wary. Statins are a good example. Like we have so much data on statins over decades, right? We know they work for a large number of people. We know that the side effects are pretty mild by the level of drugs. But we've got so much data that there are enough people who had side effects that people will point to that and say, oh, these are terrible drugs. In the absence of data on the brand new peptide that's going to, activate your mitochondria and make you live to be 120, everybody just assumes they're safe, right? And so I think it's this fallacy of human nature to assume that these things are going to work, which again, we're veering off a little bit, but I often wonder about this because, in most things, human beings gravitate towards the negative. We're gonna fear something right away. But for whatever reason in this space, it's the opposite. We're gonna just assume the best and not worry about what might go wrong. It's very odd behavior that people take when it comes to this area of health and the desire for treatments that are gonna take away all of the pain that we've got right now. I don't quite understand it, but it's an observation for sure.
Well, that's not the only observation you made. In an email earlier to me, you talked about a trip to Las Vegas you took.
Yeah.
And was that RadFest you were at, or was this a different?
No, it was RadFest. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a RadFest. Yeah. This is a conference that's been around for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years. It started as sort of a fringe conference among people who basically want to live forever. And then I would say over the last 5 years, there's been a dedicated effort to build in a science track that parallels the RadFest, get together and talk about how we want to live forever. And so I got invited to be a speaker on the scientific track. And it was actually pretty good science. Like most of the speakers in that track were legit scientists talking about real research. But there were a lot of people there, as you might imagine, who were in this sort of middle ground, experimental therapies. The vendor hall was pretty interesting. So LabCorp was there selling their blood tests, this big clinical chemistry company. And then, there were the red light people. And then there was a doctor there who was basically giving out peptide injections in the vendor hall. And to me, that was very problematic. Like, I think there is a place for responsible use of some of these peptides. Even the ones that aren't FDA approved, I think there are some where we know enough that it can be done responsibly. But this guy was just giving out injections without any medical history, without even questioning, like what conditions might you have that would make this a bad idea? And it turns out that on the last day of the conference, 2 women were hospitalized because they had very negative reactions to the peptide injections. They almost died. I don't know if anything came of that. Like in terms of consequences to the doctor, I don't know if anything ever came from that. Nobody really knows if it was the peptide that caused the reaction or if it was an impurity in the whatever the peptides were dissolved in. From what I learned, it sounds like an allergic reaction to something that was in the mixture, probably not the peptide itself. But to some extent, it doesn't matter. Like this was a licensed medical professional who actually didn't have a license in Nevada, by the way, giving out prescription medications, unapproved drugs in a vendor hall, at a hotel, at a conference in Las Vegas to anybody who walked up, and 2 women almost died from it. So that was, to me, I think, an example of how extreme sometimes things get in this space. But that wasn't even the weirdest thing that happened at that conference. So the last day also, a colleague of mine who is a scientist in the field invited me up to a hotel room to get exosomes. And I was like, you know what? I'll go with you. I am not going to get exosome injections in a hotel room in Vegas. So I go up to this hotel room. It's my colleague and another scientist getting the exosomes. This, I don't know, she was probably a 40-something woman. She's not a doctor. She has like a wellness clinic in Hollywood that she, gives people wellness advice. Anyways, she does exosomes in her clinic. She comes out with this freezer bag full of tubes and she starts, sticking the syringe down in. There's like, ooh, I gotta get down to the bottom to get the good stuff. It gets better. So then she looks at my 2 colleagues and she's like, I can kind of tell by looking at you what dose I need to give you, but to get it right, I need to feel your energy. And I'm not joking. She starts doing this like,
Whoa.
Oh, and then I'm sitting on the couch on the other side of the room, and she's doing this. And she turns around to me and she's like, she knows, I know you're not getting the exosomes, but can I send you some of their energy?
Oh my God. Did you take it?
I did. I'm like, yeah, hit me. Give me the energy. So anyways, so they went through with it. Like, to me, that whole thing is truly bizarre. And these are smart people, right? So I look at that and I'm like, what sort of risk reward calculation makes you think that this is a good idea? But what it illustrates to me is some people are just willing to try these things and trust. And I don't know what else to say beyond that, except for it's just truly bizarre what is going on out there these days.
Well, Matt, I think that one thing which is very interesting about your story is that you're like, oh, casual, take some exosomes. I'm going to bet that 95% of the people listening to this have no idea what an exosome is. So what is an exosome?
Yeah. Or if they do, they've only heard about it in the context of some miracle medical cure. Yeah. So exosomes are molecules. They're actually what are called vesicles given off usually by stem cells. So all cells in our body are constantly giving off these signals, right? And so exosomes are things we can purify that cells give off. Stem cell exosomes tend to be enriched for growth factors. So there's a hypothesis with some evidence to support it that if stem cells are good because they promote regeneration and growth, the exosomes are going to be like a super potent stem cell signal that we can purify. There's actually some good reason to do that, because then you don't have the complications of putting entire cells into people. You just put these exosomes into people. So there is legitimate science behind the idea. Like stem cells, there's very little evidence clinically that exosomes do much when injected into people. There are lots of clinics that focus on skin health, right? So beauty, that will do exosome treatments along with other things. There's a little bit of data there, but basically they're just like, you can think of them as like super potent stem cell signals. The thing that a lot of people don't realize, though, is cells give off exosomes for a couple of reasons. One is to send growth signals to other cells. The other is it's their garbage dump. So cells are always putting all of the junk that they don't want in the cell in these exosomes and secreting them. So when you take exosomes, it's a combination, in theory, of the good stuff and the garbage that the cells didn't want.
That sounds like the field of regenerative medicine. That's almost like perfect metaphor for that
analogy,
field.
Yeah.
So, all right. Regenerative medicine, there's a lot of like, especially, I guess we're sticking in stem cells because that's sort of where we've been. There's stuff that looks maybe promising, but there's a lot of regulatory problems, huckster problems, charlatan problems, faith problems, all these other things. Should anyone go out there and look for regenerative medicine treatments?
Yeah, again, I do think this still comes down to an individual choice. So in a perfect world, I'm pretty libertarian when it comes to healthcare. In a perfect world, if somebody is fully informed about the risks and potential benefits of a therapy, I think people should be able to have access to that therapy. The real challenge is, how do you make sure people are fully informed? I do want to recognize there are lots of people who have very debilitating conditions where if it's a Hail Mary and you are willing to take that risk, I support you in that. Like, I think that's something people should be able to do. So the way I would frame it is, if you're in that position where you feel like seeking these very risky experimental therapies is worth it to you, then I think thinking about how you can do the best to protect yourself from some of the bad actors that are out there is where you should be spending your time. So trying to do your own research as much as you can. I actually think, I know you're not a huge fan of AI, but I actually think this is where some of the AI tools, if used well, can help. Because I think if you prompt them correctly, some of these AI tools will give you both sides of the story. And so you can actually find out for Muse stem cells, what are the things I should be concerned about? And I'm sure you will come across the black market and, so doing your own research there, really trying to, if you have a network of medical professionals you trust, getting their opinions on where would be a place that I can get access to this, where this is somebody you trust. And then I think if you ever go to an offshore clinic, just, pay attention. Like, if you go in this clinic and it's dirty, or the doctor doesn't seem to be paying attention or know what they're talking about, like, get out of there. So I think there are probably red flags with a lot of these clinics, if people are being honest with themselves, that can warn you away from the clinics that are more likely to be taking shortcuts, be getting product that isn't what it's supposed to be. Unfortunately, right now, there isn't a lot that I can tell people about. This is a clinic that's doing these therapies that I trust. I think there are certain places where you're more likely to have a higher quality experience. I would say, and again, this is not a recommendation at all. This is just from knowing people in the field. I would say Singapore and certain places in Europe, you're more likely to find a higher quality clinic that does these kinds of therapies than places like Mexico or Latin America.
I have a very different opinion of you. I think you're more, your libertarian Calavere cowboyness is one thing. But when I look at these clinics myself, you can put a veneer that looks very shiny. And you said, like, if you trust your medical network, well, most people are getting trust through Instagram. They like Mark Hyman, they like Peterson, they like these people who have given them a great confidence. And then not everyone has the access to actual medical professionals like you do. Like, you could call up the guy who invented the stem cells and they're going to respond to your email, but they're not going to respond to the average person's email. And I think this creates this this, it's marketing, right? And people fall for it so easily. And also, by the time you get to the clinic, you bought your ticket, you've flown to Mexico, you've flown to Singapore, you've flown to everywhere, and you're like, well, the doctor can say anything to you, and you've already sunk your costs into that.
I don't disagree with you at all. I mean, that is absolutely true. And I can't fix that. Like I constantly think to myself, why would anybody believe this person on Instagram? Right? These are people who lie to you repeatedly, and yet people continue to believe them. I can't fix that. If you want to believe those people, I don't know what else to say other than I wish you the best of luck. So yeah, what you said is true. And I think it is also true that people who are desperate for help are going to be willing to take these risks. And so what I'm trying to say is, here are the things that I would do if I was in that boat.
So recently, you have this history with David Sinclair. I've done some videos on David Sinclair. We met over David Sinclair, actually. Recently, he went on Diary of a CEO, and he said that soon there's going to be a pill that can reverse your age. He said that he's cured blindness in dogs, and they're doing the first human clinical trial on some sort of fix for blindness. Has he turned a corner? Is he now on the up and up, or what do you feel?
Well, no. So here's, we were just talking about people who keep saying things that aren't true, and yet other people keep believing them. I mean, David has a track record of saying things that aren't true. Usually, if you're a scientist and you say things that aren't true about your research or other people's research, there are consequences associated with that. David seems to largely be able to avoid those consequences. And so I don't understand why people would think it's different now. It's not. So here's the truth about reversing aging. So partly this depends on how you want to define reversing aging. What David implies is that he's taken an old person and made them young again, or taken an old mouse and made them young again. That hasn't happened. Nobody has done that. Every expert in the field, if you ask them that question, will tell you that has not happened. It's not even close to happening. But it's pretty easy to reverse certain things that change with age, right? Certain functional declines or phenotypes that change with age. I can take, the gray hair that I've got here and dye it black, and I've reversed something that changes with age. Did I make myself younger again? No, but I've reversed part of aging. And so what many people have done, this isn't even really David's research primarily, what many people have done is use something called epigenetic reprogramming to reverse the epigenetic changes that happen during aging in cells. And when you do that, the cells function better. And so some people have shown in mice, you can cause certain tissues to function better in an old mouse if you use this approach. The mice are not young again. And so I think this is where that you can get away with, exaggerating, if that's what you want to call intentionally misleading people, because there are aspects of it that are true, but nobody's made an old mouse young again or an old person young again. The other thing that I think is important for people to appreciate is it's actually pretty easy to do that in humans. If you take a 55-year-old man who's been sedentary, eats a crappy diet, doesn't sleep well, and doesn't have any friends, and you get him to eat a good diet, start working out, focus on sleep, and make some friends, that person is going to get healthier, right? They're going to reverse many features of aging. We didn't reverse aging. So this is not a big deal to do this, in people. I think the epigenetic reprogramming has a lot of potential, and that's where it leads to the curing blindness part. So one of the things that's been done with epigenetic reprogramming in mice, and this is work from David's lab, is in a specific mouse eye disease model. You can use this epigenetic reprogramming to partially reverse blindness in that disease model. And so David has started a company called Life Biosciences. And this, I think, is where we get into the real potential, right? Who have gotten approval by FDA to start a human clinical trial using this epigenetic reprogramming technology to try to see whether, first of all, it's safe in people, and then secondly, they can have some impact on specific eye conditions in humans. So we're probably 5 to 10 years away from that getting into real clinical medicine, and that's if everything goes well. But it is real progress. So I don't want to diminish the fact there is some kernel of truth here that this technology, epigenetic reprogramming, could be beneficial for certain forms of blindness, for other types of diseases, maybe even for certain aspects of aging. But the idea that it's going to cure all blindness or that it's going to cause 60-year-old people to become 20-year-olds is just nonsense. It's just made up. And so I think, unfortunately, David still struggles to like stick to the facts when it comes to his own science and other people's science.
I think that anytime someone goes and saying, we're just going to start human trials, we should realize that that is not the completion of a clinical trial. And usually you need more than one human trial to get to the point where you're like, this is real. And I feel like that when you're marketing first, you lose a lot of respect in my mind. Although I understand why people want to do it, because science takes so darn long to get anything out the door. So, and we have a sort of a broken overall system that puts us, in this situation. When you go on Diary of a CEO and that's your announcement mechanism, it's problematic.
That's the world we live in, right?
Mm-hmm. So, this has been a really fascinating conversation. And I think it's really, wait. I had one question. This was stored in my mind from earlier. You had said that if you take if you give stem cells to older people, those stem cells are less effective. And and I know that you and I have some disagreements on the reality of biological age. I think it's sort of a bullshit concept. I understand why you're using it. I think it leads to misunderstandings of literally reversing age. But let's go. Let me just put that question to the side for a second. What if you have reversed someone's biological age, who's 45, in their cellular ways? Will then stem cells work better on them?
Depends on exactly what you've done. So this is where I think at some point it would be really fun for you and I to be able to dive deep into this, because I think I can convince you that biological age is a valid concept. We can't measure it. I think we would also agree to that. So this goes to what I was getting at before, though, right? Which is that biological age is what systems biologists call an emergent property, meaning there's lots and lots of stuff that leads to this emergent property. And so we can reverse, tens or hundreds or even thousands of those mechanisms without reversing everything that is biological aging. And so, yes, there are ways that you can make stem cells work better in aged animals or aged people. One really potent way is to just bring down the chronic inflammation, because it's the chronic inflammation, or what people call inflammaging, to some extent that impairs stem cells within the tissue from being able to do their normal jobs. And so if you can blunt those chronic inflammatory signals, you can allow stem cells, the stem cells that remain, to actually have their full regenerative potential. And so there are a variety of approaches that people are attempting. I actually think, and again, this is a little bit speculative, but there's good animal data on this. I actually think that, a short fast before, and again, I'm not recommending this. This is speculation. A short fast before a stem cell therapy, or a short course of something like rapamycin, which is a potent anti-inflammatory, will actually likely improve the ability of that stem cell, either your resident stem cells or the stem cell therapy, to have the regenerative properties that you're hoping for. So yes, there are ways to do that. But again, you don't have to reverse everything that is biological aging to have that impact on why stem cells aren't functioning as well in an aged person as they would in a young person.
I found it really interesting that you just said, if you fast a little bit, and then you immediately retracted to say, this isn't medical advice or whatever, because I think this is the world that we live in where everything is a touchstone issue right now. Because we know the all carnivore people, the intermittent fasting people,
That's not why I did it. I did it because I'm speculating from animal data and now talking about humans. And I don't actually have the data in humans to say that's going to work. So while I might personally believe that it would, I haven't done the experiment. As far as I know, nobody else has done the experiment. So I want to put the appropriate cautionary there, not because I care what the carnivore people think. Like, the carnivore people are going to think what they're going to think regardless of what I say. And also because personally, I don't like fasting. I like to eat. And so I'm sort of anti-fasting for personal reasons.
And I am with you right there. I had a great breakfast today. I'm going to go for lunch and dinner. And, that's just the way it's going to be.
There you go.
Well, again, thank you so much for being on this show. I always love talking to you. And for anyone who wants to find out more about Matt, there are links in the old description. If I can, I'll add you as a contributor on this. So it'll be Optispan.
Yeah, we'll collaborate on YouTube.
Yeah. So then you guys can just go see it. Otherwise, I think you just put his name into the Google search, Matt Kaeberlein, with Kaeberlein. Is that right?
You got it. I'm
Oh,
really
man.
easy to find on the internet, so it's not hard.
So go find him. And again, thank you so much to everyone who was here. I just appreciate you tuning in and listening to this. And it was cool to be able to do sort of a more free-form discussion because next week we're going to be getting into the black market on stem cells, Adil Khan, and I've just gotten inundated by receipts and confidential sources and really sketchy people and insane people and then doctors who are super credible. Like it is like I am sifting through a mountain of data and it's gonna all I can tell you for sure is it's going to be a good episode. So stay tuned. I got the whole Substack thing, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm going to watch it. I'm looking forward to it.
You are a premium subscriber. I saw Matt came in as a premium subscriber. You know who else came in? Ben Greenfield.
Okay.
Greenfield.
I thought you were going to say David Sinclair.
AG1 is also a premium subscriber. I think there's a lot of people who watch me are like, are they going to do it?
I kept listening to your YouTube videos on my drive into work. And at the back end of every one, you're like, subscribe on Substack. I'm like, you know what? I'm getting so much benefit from this. I really should subscribe. So I did. And so you're right.
And that was not a planned plug, guys. That was an authentic
genuine.
Plug. All right. Well, from Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates. Thank you so much to my supporters here on Patreon and on Substack and even on YouTube who make this work possible. It means the world to me that you're here. And if you want to get your name on the honor roll, all you need to do is sign up at the links down below. From Foxtopus Inc. in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates.